if Ukraine were to permanently abandon Crimea in return for NATO membership, then I think there might be a deal that everyone could get around the table for. And that has been the question that's been confronting people dealing with Ukraine since 1991 when it broke free, arguably since the 18th century when the Brits fought a war over this in the 19th century, the Crimean War. That has been the flashpoint for about 300 years. But as to whether anyone, this isn't just about Trump, this is about a Harris or a Sullivan or a Zelensky or a Scholz, as to whether anyone is willing to do that deal is another question. And of course, the other problem is that, if we were to do that deal and the Russians don't stick by their word and they launch another invasion of Ukraine, then, your children, my nieces, whatever, are on the hook to defend that place.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Peter Apps, who's appearing at the Times and Sunday Times Cheltenham Literature Festival to discuss his book Deterring Armageddon, a biography of NATO. Peter, welcome to Frontline.
Good to be here.
Is NATO more important now than ever?
I don't know it's more important now than ever, but this is definitely one of the most important periods in its history. I think to find a period where it was this important, you probably have to go back to the late 1940s, early 1950s when it was actually created. So to put the clock back to the end of World War II, Hitler's dead, Soviet Union dominates Eastern Europe, and the Americans are at a period of political unpredictability. So, it's not very clear who's going to replace Truman. It's not very clear whether the US is going to do what it did in the 30s, and after the First World War, become isolationist and turn its back on the rest of Europe. And Europe is really a mess. So, again, another sort of comparison to today, you've got, a British Labour government in office with elected unquestionably to do domestic things. So lots of stuff going on, and a real worry that the Russians will attempt what one US diplomat called salami tactics. So gradually sort of take more and more of West Berlin, then West Germany, and then places like Yugoslavia, maybe Norway, and gradually sort of start really taking apart this still destroyed continent. And NATO did several things. The first and most important is probably that it tied America into the continent. America is the sole nuclear power in 1949 when NATO is created. It means that you can't attack any member nation without risking being at war with all of them. And eventually that basically holds the Cold War in a dangerous but very real stasis for more than 40 years. And then, of course, that all changes in 1991. So I think you wouldn't have had the first Cold War looking the way it did without NATO. Again, a sort of comparison today, immediately after the outbreak of the Korean War in June of 1950, NATO initially doesn't have any kind of military command structure. That's built very, very fast by Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1951. The great World War II general, he's brought back as NATO's Supreme Allied Commander of Europe. So that was probably the most important point in NATO's history. The Cold War wouldn't have turned out the same way if it hadn't existed. But I think the post-Ukraine invasion era is probably punching in pretty hard at number two. Because it's not dissimilar environment. Again, you've had this unexpected massive war in Ukraine this time. You've got, as you had in the 1950s, an aggressive Russia and China who are coordinating with each other. And you've got NATO as being it's not the only way you could do it, but it's probably the most successful way you can do it, of tying America into the defense of Europe. Now, none of that means that everything is to be taken for granted. We might talk about Donald Trump in a second, coming back in potentially in November. But I think, if you look at the way in which Europe has shaped up over the last 3 years, since Putin started putting his tanks properly on the Ukraine border prior to that invasion, it's worked out the way it has because of NATO. Ukraine wasn't in NATO, so it got clobbered. The Baltic states were, so they haven't been. And therefore, in terms of the defense of Europe, it's probably as important as it's been since its very start.
Yeah, I do want to come on to Donald Trump and what a potential second Trump presidency might mean for the alliance in a moment. We should just mention, of course, in recent weeks, Mark Rutte, the former Dutch Prime Minister, has taken over as Secretary General from Jens Stoltenberg, who had held the position since 2014. How significant is that shift? And aside from Ukraine, which seems to be the biggest issue facing him, what else is in his in tray?
So, I think firstly, it's worth bearing in mind that Stoltenberg is again, one of the most one of the really big secretary generals in NATO history. And he's someone who, by nature of being the Norwegian prime minister back in the 2000s, so he's a contemporary of Tony Blair. He's been at the top table that whole time. He, as Norwegian prime minister in 2006, 7, 8, was responsible for moving the Norwegian army up to the north. So one of the first people to sort of confront that Russian threat, which became quite clear to the Norwegians a long time before it became clear to everyone else. Became Secretary General just after the annexation of Crimea in 2014. So his entire decade in office has been really dominated by that rising Russia threat. And he has, he's described as a Trump whisperer. He's very good at keeping Trump on side. He spent a lot of time talking to Erdogan. He spends a lot of time talking to the Hungarians. There's a lot of cajoling Sherpa into keeping NATO working. And he's been very, very good at that. Mark Rutte, again, very new in office, very experienced politician, again, comes from a very similar European coalition background. We don't do this very often in the UK. We have very different kind of psychodrama around how we run our governments usually. Even the one coalition that we had was very atypical. Whereas someone like Stoltenberg or Rutte is, this is what they do for a living, is getting people who they don't necessarily agree with on their side to come up with some kind of coherent policy. People have been talking about Rutte as a Secretary General for a very long time. And to be blunt, until he was kicked out of power in Holland, or looked like he was going to be, he wasn't available. Stoltenberg's been on the record as saying he would like to step down several years ago. But I think there are several big questions about Rutte. They're all shaped by Ukraine. Ukraine has fundamentally changed that global environment. Who's going to be the new US president? Whoever the new US president is, the Americans are very distracted by Asia. And to an lesser extent, the Middle East. They want Europe to step up. That's going to be true whether it's Harris, or Trump, or indeed, and it's going to be true beyond the next presidential term. How does the alliance deal with several different models for defending Europe? So we talk about the Poles and the Baltics as if they're the same. They both dislike the Russians a lot, but actually they have very different approaches. The Estonians, the Latvians, the Lithuanians, the Nordics, very conscription heavy. They conscript several thousand young men and women a year. Some of them just have male conscription, some have both, and they can scale that up in time of war. The Poles, on the other hand, go very heavy tech and big equipment, tanks, Apache attack helicopters, drones, fixed fortifications, artificial intelligence, much more high-tech approach. They're not willing to introduce conscription because they don't think they get it past their people. The Germans sort of somewhere on that kind of spectrum, and the Brits betting very hard on technologies. There's lots of kind of different visions as to how you defend Europe. The big thing for everyone, and it includes Europe, is Taiwan. The Americans believe that Xi Jinping has ordered his military to be ready to invade by 2027. That sets the agenda for Europe. So if you look at all these procurement things, whether it's barriers in the Baltic states and Poland, or the Brits trying to get sort of drones on board, 2027 is that hard date everyone's working towards. Doesn't mean that they think there'll necessarily be a war at that point. But the Americans are very worried about a war over the next 5 to 7 years. Why the next 5 to 7 years? Because of Chinese demographics. So if the Chinese are going to go to war, the best time for them to do so, the Americans think, is in about the next 7 or 8 years. After that, they have a lot more old people, and therefore it's a lot harder. So that drives the agenda in Europe, because if you talk to people in the Baltic states and elsewhere, the number one likely trigger for an attack on Europe would be a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. America will be divided. So, everyone's trying to meet that kind of deadline. NATO does not have responsibilities in Asia. It's never going to have responsibilities in Asia. The North Atlantic Treaty limits it to the North Atlantic area. So even if Pearl Harbor were attacked, Article 5 doesn't get triggered. But, the Asians are trying to work out what they're going to do. There's some Japanese suggestions about a NATO in Asia. So another sort of treaty organization. I think there's a lot of appetite for that in the ultra short term. In the medium to long term, that may well be where it's going, particularly if you're looking at kind of containing China the same way that the Soviet Union was contained in the 80s. So lots of moving parts. And also the last point, which Rutte will be very aware of, obviously, is the rise of the far right in Europe. NATO has never been built to interfere in its own country's domestic politics. It would be a bad idea if it did. But there are some very different futures for Europe. And, for example, if in 10 years' time, Alternative for Deutschland, the right-wing party is running Germany, National Front was running France, that would be a very different NATO, and whoever was running it would have to navigate that. So it's not just Trump, there's lots of other moving pieces.
Let's come on to Donald Trump. Were he to return to the White House next month, what do you think it would mean for NATO? Some people suggest he could even go as far as withdrawing from the alliance one day. He certainly had threatened or made noises in his first term that implied that, although he was stopped by a lot of his advisors. And some people say that was a bluff because he wanted European countries in NATO to increase their defence spending, and there's a decent case to be made for that. But what do you think his approach to NATO would be?
Well, so I think the first The first thing about Donald Trump is that he's very unpredictable. That's the kind of, and it's essentially a feature, not a bug. So the Americans who have, particularly sort of former senior US officials, have sympathy with Trump, or even those who don't, he will be unpredictable. And when the facts change, he changes his mind, and when the facts don't change, he also sometimes changes his mind. So, John Bolton, who was his national security advisor, has been saying for years that he thinks Trump would quit NATO at some point because he thinks that Trump is a sort of showman, and that is the sort of thing that he will do at some point. So he's the man who does it. It'll be challenging. The last Pentagon budget had an amendment attached to it by Tim Kaine, Senator for Virginia, Marco Rubio, Senator for Florida. So bipartisan amendment that means that quitting NATO has to be agreed by both Congress and the Senate. That's quite hard. They're very popular in both. I think there are several questions that a new Trump administration, or indeed a Harris administration, will have to answer. The first is what you do about Ukraine. And again, that will shape everything. And that could go in a variety of different ways, frankly. There's obviously talk about doing a peace deal. If there is a peace deal, does that include security guarantees for Ukraine? Does that involve bringing Ukraine into NATO? With Trump, I think nothing's unpredictable. So, yes, he might leave NATO. He might expand NATO to include Ukraine. They're both plausible outcomes. And there are people, Mike Pompeo, who'll be a Secretary of State again, very likely, very pro-Ukraine, believes that only by defending Ukraine can you defend Taiwan. Elbridge Colby, who may well be his national security advisor, completely different approach, believes that actually the US should be ready to abandon both Ukraine and Taiwan if they need to, so that it can look after its own security interests and hold China in particular back sort of in the bigger picture. And also, it's a fair assumption that anyone who is working with Trump, although Mike Pompeo has handled this relatively well, tends to get upset with him, and Trump throws his toys out the pram and fires them at some point. So whoever Trump starts out with, he's very unlikely to finish with. A lot would depend on how well Rutte does it. I think one of the reasons they didn't go with Ursula von der Leyen is that she would definitely have played badly with Trump. They have a pre-existing bad relationship, and that would have meant that things would have got off to a bad start and probably got worse. I think those first kind of meetings between Rutte and Trump are going to be quite important if it happens. But also, we don't know much about a Harris administration. We don't know who her top picks are going to be. We don't know what approach they're going to take. Most of the people she's hired have been in Biden's National Security Council or advising her. But they have quite different approaches. We could even see a second term of Jake Sullivan as National Security Advisor. So all of those things are kind of in the wind. And then again, you have what actually happens in the real world. Do the Ukrainians are running out of people? What the Ukrainians would like is ideally European troops on their soil doing training, but also acting as a blocking position north of Kyiv. They thought they were going to get it earlier this year. Macron was up for it. Then Macron got emasculated in his elections, and that plan's been dropped. So, there's lots and lots of moving parts, and we could see a major war in the Middle East sometime between now and, whenever this podcast comes out. So, there's a lot of stuff going on. Worth pointing out, last point on the Middle East, there are two US aircraft carriers in the Middle East. That's the bulk of US naval strike forces. That means they're not in Europe, it means they're not in Asia. So again, events can really change things. And most Secretary Generals have ended up facing a world they didn't quite expect to.
There's been a lot of talk this year about NATO trying to Trump-proof itself, or indeed Ukraine's allies trying to Trump-proof support for Ukraine. To what extent do you think that will be successful if indeed Trump does win again?
I mean, the first point is that the Europeans, and I would include the Brits in this, have not really got their defence industrial base together. The North Koreans are giving Russia about 3 million artillery shells a year. The combined industry of the US plus Europe cannot meet that. And it doesn't look like it's going to be able to meet it anytime particularly soon. The US are stepping up their drone production, so is Europe. But again, the US have have slightly deeper pockets, but no one has very much. So I think there are problems that go beyond Trump. The Ramstein process, which is now NATO has more of a dog in, it's not quite clear how it's going to work, but that's the process by which Ukraine gets weapons, is quite important, but actually most things get agreed bilaterally anyway. The Trump administration gave Javelin anti-tank rockets to Ukraine. A new Trump administration may well do the same thing. But the bigger picture is, and again, this is not really about Trump. It's about making sure that Europe is able to defend itself, because the Americans will have only limited clout, because they will also be in the Far East. And if you look at what the Germans have done, the Canadians have done, both of which take a lot of flack for not spending 2.5% of GDP. They're both moving a brigade permanently into the Baltics, or at least permanently for the next few years, building base infrastructure there. That just means there's a lot of European and Canadian troops and American troops in Poland who you need to run over to invade the continent, and that's the kind of big tripwire. And I think Europe will be spending a lot more on defence than when Trump came in 2016, and he may well take that as a win.
I mean, I suppose it also raised the question, well, how much more should we be spending on defence? You've got the Conservative Party leadership contest happening in the UK now, several candidates pledging we need to go to 3% of GDP in terms of defence spending. Is that even enough?
I mean, I think we could burn 3% of GDP on nothing useful tomorrow. We're about the seventh largest spender on defence in terms of globally, and we just sent one of our 6 or 7 attack submarines. The first one went to sea for 108 something days. So a lot of our kit, we spend a huge amount of money. We don't get that much out of it. If you look at someone like Finland, who spends a lot less than us, I mean, a huge amount less than us, but they have a reserves that are about 150,000 strong, substantially bigger than the British Army. And essentially they do that by training up a lot of Finns to fight, and they wouldn't have the money to pay all of them in time of war unless they would get budgetary support from the European Union. So they couldn't actually employ those people full time, except in time of war. But in time of war, obviously they would, because it would be an existential battle. So I think, to be candid, the Finns are probably the upper edge for bang per buck in terms of what they get. The Poles are spending a lot, about 4% GDP, heavily on kit. That's probably a good shout. But again, there are questions about when that gets delivered. Is their industry up to it? I think it's more about what you do with it than how much you spend, to be candid. We spend a lot of money on things that don't work particularly well. There are certain things we have to spend a lot of money on. If Trump was to leave NATO, the British and French strategic nuclear deterrent goes from being a bit of a weird thing that the two countries have that doesn't really change the price of fish to the existential nuclear defense of Europe. And the French take that very seriously. And I think we would take it seriously in the event of Trump leaving NATO. And that means we don't have a lot of choice, but to actually build that's a huge amount of stuff. I think the biggest question, and I'm alluding to it, is how fast can you scale? So to deter Russia, the first question is, can you give them a bloody nose when they come across the front? So the answer to that is yes, definitely with the Americans. It's a bit more challenging without, because particularly a lot of the air power that the Americans bring to Europe would potentially vanish. Your second question, and Ukraine has shown this, is can you still be in the fight in 3 to 5 years' time of a really long war? So Russia has a population of about 140 million. So clearly Ukraine now have less than 30 million. You can see what that means on the ground. European Union has 300 million. Now that means that in a battle of industrial strength plus human capital, which is what both world wars were, it's what the Ukraine wars turned into, the Europeans can outgun the Russians because there are twice as many of them. How does Britain play into that? Do we want to be in a situation where we can scale? I would say Britain has one existential threat that doesn't particularly relate to NATO would be gone in this scenario. We don't face an existential threat unless Germany and France get taken over by pro-Putin far-rightists. And if they did, and that's not an unthinkable prospect in the next 10, 15 years, then there's an authoritarian bloc that extends from the Korean Peninsula to the Straits of Dover. Now, under those circumstances, you probably want to have a much larger army and probably less kit, but more weaponry, if you see what I mean. Aircraft carriers not terribly useful in that kind of scenario. Lots and lots of infantry, yes. So, if you look at what a lot of countries are looking at how you scale, that's not the way the British Army has ever really thought. And I don't think it's not a partisan issue here, I don't think. You saw with Rishi Sunak suggesting conscription, it wasn't done in a very mature way. The world would have to get a lot worse over the next 3 to 5 years before Britain started thinking that kind of unthinkable. But if things did go that way, so for example, if we saw, an escalation into what we saw in Ukraine and the Baltic states, a long-running war there, then I think we would have to think very differently about defence. But that also means the Americans think about this a lot. It takes a very long time to build a ship. It takes quite a long time to build a tank. It takes quite a long time to train a sort of very experienced soldier. Your ability to restock has to be faster than that. So the Ukrainians were training soldiers, getting them on the ground in 72 hours during the invasion of Kiev, sometimes a bit less. Drones can be built faster than fast jets. So your industrial base has to not quite look like an old-fashioned industrial base, but you have to still be in the fight in year 2, month 3, year 3. And if you do that, you'll never have to fight the war because they won't come. And that's the question that lots of places face, and everyone faces it slightly differently. And I think the Strategic Defence Review here will have to engage with that. And it's going to be interesting to see what answers they come up with.
And just finally, Peter, how would you assess the likelihood of Ukraine becoming a full member of NATO in the next few years? I
mean, I think if I was Ukrainian, I'd say either it becomes a full member of NATO or becomes a full member of the Russian Federation on a 25, 30-year basis. If we're going to leave them out in the cold forever, I mean, it doesn't have to be NATO. They're more likely to become a member of the European Union. The European Union has its own territorial defence clause, and it has its own nuclear weapons through the French. So, it's not the only path. The only way that Ukraine would be able to accept politically losing large chunks of its territory would be if that came with a territorial guarantee. And then NATO is the best way of doing that. I think it's going to come down to the next president of the United States. It's going to come down to the current or next chancellor of Germany. It's going to come down to the next president of France. I don't think most British prime ministers that we've had recently would have vetoed NATO Ukraine membership if other people were going for it. I think on a 20-year basis, it's probably inevitable. I think on a 5-year basis, it's probably about a 35% likelihood. And again, my instinct is that the deal to be done, I think, I don't know if it can be done, but if I was, is if Ukraine were to permanently abandon Crimea in return for NATO membership, then I think there might be a deal that everyone could get around the table for. And that has been the question that's been confronting people dealing with Ukraine since 1991 when it broke free, arguably since the 18th century when, the Brits fought a war over this in the 19th century, the Crimean War. So that has been the flashpoint for about 300 years. But as to whether anyone, this isn't just about Trump, this is about, a Harris or a Sullivan or a Zelensky or a Scholz, as to whether anyone is willing to do that deal is another question. And of course, the other problem is that, if we were to do that deal and the Russians don't stick by their word and they launch another invasion of Ukraine, then, your children, my nieces, whatever, are on the hook to defend that place. And, I don't know that there is a societal feeling here or Germany. The Poles would rather fight in Ukraine than Poland. That's very understandable. Germany, France, Portugal, Britain, that's a much more complicated question.
Peter, really appreciate your time. Peter's book is called Deterring Armageddon, a biography of NATO, and you can see him discussing it at the Times and Sunday Times Cheltenham Literature Festival. Peter Apps, a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.